There's an observation that I've heard a number of people make about the letter C, and one that I do not agree with. In English, people argue, the letter C is completely redundant, and the alphabet doesn't need it. After all, they then go on to explain, C has two main sounds that it represents, both of which are covered by other, less ambiguous letters. We could make English spelling far more regular and consistent by removing the letter C altogether, and replacing it with either K or S, depending on its pronunciation. This is incorrect. While there are certainly some languages where you could remove the letter C without needing to fundamentally change the way spelling works, English is not one of them. English orthography is a very complex system with a large number of interlocking parts. You cannot simply remove the letter C without completely reworking everything else around it. And to what end? To remove the ambiguity between hard C and soft C? True, there are some words where the pronunciation of C is unclear, but very few of them are ones where merely replacing C with K or S would actually make it possible to determine pronunciation from spelling. The letter C's reputation among English speakers of being unnecessary is shared with very few other letters, and even though the argument for C being a redundant letter is much weaker than the arguments against Q or X, C is still the letter that the most people have made this claim about. And it's a shame, because C is a lovely letter, both aesthetically and functionally. I'm a big fan. Perhaps what people need is to understand how we got here, where this letter came from, and why its different pronunciations exist. That way, we can gain an appreciation for this underlooked letter. I'm Misali, and this is the story of C. I already talked about the history of the Latin alphabet in depth in my video about the letter W, but it'll still be useful to start at the beginning. About 4,000 years ago, the Proto-Sinaitic script was invented, most likely inspired by the much older Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Proto-Sinaitic script was the common ancestor of what is today the single largest family of writing systems in the world. Each letter of the script was a simple drawing of something with a name that starts with the same sound the letter represents. The reason it's assumed that Proto-Sinaitic was in some way based on Egyptian hieroglyphs is that the majority of letters used in the script had corresponding characters used in Egyptian. The two writing systems were used for different languages, and the phonetic value of each letter in Proto-Sinaitic was based on its name in the Northwest Semitic language the script was designed for, rather than its phonetic value in Egyptian. And as such, the link between the two writing systems is purely visual rather than structural. Nonetheless, there was one Egyptian hieroglyph that will be very relevant to our story. Like most hieroglyphs, it had a few different ways it could be read. This character represented a throw stick, a ma'at, but it was also commonly used for the verb kema, which meant throw or create. This throw stick is the earliest ancestor of the modern letter C. The Proto-Sinaitic script also happened to contain a letter representing a throw stick, one with a similarly simple shape but at a different orientation. This is the letter gaml. In the Proto-Sinaitic script, as in the many Semitic abjads that descend from it, it represented the consonant sound g. While gaml is the direct ancestor of C, the story of C would be incomplete if all we did was examine its direct lineage. In fact, it will be helpful to examine the entire Proto-Sinaitic script as a whole system. Several letters here will be directly relevant to the story of C later down the line. Over the course of many centuries, the Proto-Sinaitic script slowly changed and diverged into many different daughter writing systems. The one which is most relevant to our story, as you may already know, is the Phoenician alphabet. At some point along the way from Proto-Sinaitic to the Phoenician alphabet, the letter gaml was renamed to gimel, which also stopped meaning throw stick. The orientation changed back to something more like the original hieroglyph that came before it. Most retellings of the history of the Latin alphabet start around here, with the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn was the basis of the Greek alphabet. But it's important to remember that this story is not a linear progression. This is not the story of the evolution from the primitive pictographic representations of language made by a Stone Age pre-literate society to the advanced civilized system of writing we have today. Nor is it the story of how the pure written language of our ancestors degraded over time to a corrupted form in use now. The creation of the Proto-Sinaitic script, its development into the Phoenician alphabet, and especially the later developments of the Greek, Etruscan, and Latin alphabets, as much as our modern perspective might make it seem, was not a straight path through history, and the Latin alphabet was not the singular endpoint. The descendants of Proto-Sinaitic comprised the largest family of writing systems in use in the modern world, and the thousands of years of divergent histories have resulted in a beautiful diversity of scripts, each one with a story just as rich as that of the Latin alphabet. However, we must stay focused. This is the story of not the entire Latin alphabet, but just a single letter within it, remember? Phoenician and Ancient Greek were very different languages. The 22 consonant letters of the Phoenician alphabet included letters for many sounds that the Greek language simply did not contain. The earliest form of the Greek alphabet repurposed many of these extra letters for additional phonemes found in Ancient Greek that were not present in Phoenician, but some pairs of letters represented the same sounds as each other, preserving a distinction found in Phoenician that the Greeks had no use for. For instance, the 4 distinct sibilant consonants in Phoenician had their values changed considerably. One letter, samek, was dropped altogether, and the remaining 2 voiceless sibilants now both represented s, which was the very phoneme samek had originally represented. As for the voiced sibilant, zayin, the pronunciation of its descendant in this very early form of the Greek alphabet is uncertain. Many linguists have suggested that the most likely pronunciation was the consonant cluster zd, while others claim it was more likely to have been the affricate z. It could also be the case that both pronunciations coexisted in different parts of Greece, and that neither is more correct than the other. More relevant to the story of C, however, is the pair of consonants that would come to be known as kappa and kopa, both of which represented the voiceless velar plosive k. In Phoenician, the letters kap and kop were used for a velar k and a uvular ko, respectively. This uvular consonant would have been completely unfamiliar to anyone who spoke Ancient Greek as their sole language, and they probably had a difficult time hearing the difference between these two sounds. However, since a uvular consonant requires the back of the tongue to make contact with the uvula, this has a noticeable effect on the sound of nearby vowels within a word. Perhaps because of this, the letter kopo is used, for a time, to represent the same consonant sound as kappa whenever it occurred before back-rounded vowels, such as oo or o. Not quite the same distribution it had in Phoenician, but it is similar. This use of kopa did not last terribly long, and the letter would eventually be dropped from the Greek alphabet entirely. But this short-lived letter would come to have a direct effect on the way the Latin alphabet is still used today. By the way, our friend gaml, you might have noticed, made its way into the Greek alphabet more or less fully preserved. Its shape and pronunciation are almost completely unchanged. However, if you know what the Greek alphabet looks like in modern times, it might seem like this letter is backwards. In fact, many letters appear to be backwards. Were they flipped horizontally at one point? As a matter of fact, they were. Now is a good time to bring up one aspect of these scripts that I've neglected to mention up until this point: directionality. The Latin alphabet, and indeed the current Greek alphabet, are both written from left to right. As you know, this is not universal among all writing systems. The Semitic abjads in use today, such as the Arabic script, are generally written in the opposite direction, from right to left. Even though these scripts share a common ancestor, a design aspect as fundamental as what direction to read in is completely reversed. How can this be? This discrepancy had its origin all the way back at the source, Egyptian hieroglyphs. The intricate designs of hieroglyphs were commonly shown in line with full illustrations of what the text was saying, while the more common default order was for text to be written from right to left. When paired with these illustrations, it was common to have the characters of the text face the same direction as the characters in the illustration for aesthetic purposes, which meant that sometimes text ran from left to right instead. This free directionality was copied by the Proto-Sinaitic script, and consequently inherited into Phoenician, and then into Greek. Along the way, however, the preferred default directionality changed from RTL to LTR, but in this earliest stage of the Greek alphabet, both directionalities were used. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. After all, the ancient Greek language still had a decent number of phonemes that still did not have letters. As I've already discussed thoroughly, a semi-new letter named wow was used for the semi-vowel w that would later disappear from the Greek language altogether. And, while the Phoenician emphatic alveolar stop was reused for the ancient Greek aspirated alveolar stop, new letters would still need to be created for the other 2 aspirated stops that were in the language at the time. One of these letters was phi, and as for the other one, well, this is where things begin to diverge. In some parts of ancient Greece, a letter you might know as chi was added for this velar aspirate. While this was more than sufficient to represent the consonant phonemes of the version of Greek spoken at the time, for somewhat complicated reasons, a pair of additional consonants were also added to represent the consonant clusters psa and xa, with the letter for xa bringing back the shape of the once discarded Phoenician letter samek. With our modern understanding of phonetics, it's easy to look back at the ancient Greeks figuring out this whole alphabet thing and say they clearly didn't need these letters, that there's no way they could have considered any of these clusters to be single sounds in their own right. However, when examining the phonological history of the Greek language, these particular consonant sequences did, in a sense, behave as single units. Not phonetically, not even phonemically, but when examining the structures of words themselves, you could certainly justify interpreting them in this way. This particular form of the archaic Greek alphabet was used in Ionia, and would go on to become the standard alphabet used throughout Greece to this day. However, this is not the version of the Greek alphabet that the Latin alphabet descends from. That alphabet was the one used in Western Greece. sometimes distinguished from the other Greek alphabet as the Cumaean alphabet. The letter it used for the aspirated velar plosive was one which had the same shape as the early version of psi found in other parts of Greece. And while this alphabet had no letter to represent ps, it made use of a letter shaped the same as the Eastern chi to represent x. I'm not entirely sure what the circumstances of this switcheroo were. Which of these implementations of these new letters came first? It probably doesn't matter. What's relevant to our story is that this, the Cumaean alphabet, is the version of the Greek alphabet that the Etruscans used to write their language. And it is here, with the adaptation of the Greek alphabet for the Etruscan language, where some of the most relevant things to the story of the letter C happened. Most visibly, this is when the Greek gamma takes on a shape without the angle that originally defined the throw stick it descends from. Along with many other letters, its shape becomes softer and more rounded, transforming into something nearly identical to the Latin letter C. Not much is known about Etruscan, but it is known that it was a very different language from ancient Greek, just as different as Greek was from Phoenician. In terms of its consonant inventory, the ancient Greek language contained 3 series of plosives, distinguished by voicing and aspiration. Phoenician, and Latin for that matter, distinguished stops only by voicelessness, and Etruscan, in contrast, distinguished only aspiration. Because of this, the letters representing voice stops in ancient Greek, beta, delta, and gamma, were all pronounced the same way in Etruscan as their corresponding voiceless unaspirated stops, pi, tau, and kappa. This doubling up with letters for tenuous stops was at its most extreme with the letters for k, since Greek already used 2 different letters for this phoneme. And so, a 3-way distinction in Phoenician was transferred into Greek as a 2-way distinction, and then into Etruscan as 3 separate letters for 1 consonant. Just like the early Greek alphabet they were copying, the earliest form of the Etruscan alphabet used their version of kopa to represent g when it occurred before back-rounded vowels. As for the ancient Greek voiceless pairs, Etruscan preserved them when writing Greek words, but as these distinctions did not exist in native Etruscan words, 1 letter in each pair was used as the default. While eventually these extra letters would be dropped from the Etruscan alphabet altogether, their presence in this earlier form is extremely relevant to this story. These letters, which were used meaningfully for Greek but not for Etruscan, turned out to be very useful for the Italic tribes who learned how to write from the Etruscans. These Old Italic languages, the most historically relevant of which being Old Latin, had 2 stop series distinguished by voicelessness and not aspiration. And it is here where we can finally answer the single most important question about the role the letter C has in the Latin alphabet. Why does the Latin alphabet contain 3 separate letters that all represent the sound g? While in the present, millennia removed from the initial invention of the Latin alphabet, the letters C, K, and Q are very often used for different things. Latin, at the point its alphabet was first invented, used all 3 of them for the same sound, or actually, sounds. When the Latins were first taught how to write, the Etruscans who explained it to them knew that the extra letters in their alphabet were used by the Greeks to represent sounds the Etruscan language did not have, and they also knew what those sounds were. They probably explained it like this. This is the letter for b, this is the letter the Greeks use for b. This is the letter for d, this is the letter the Greeks use for d. This is the letter for g, and this is the letter the Greeks use for g. For 2 of the voiceless pairs, pi and beta, tau and delta, the letter only used in Greek words happened to be the voiced one, but for the other pair, kappa and gamma, it was the voiceless one that was exclusive to Greek words. And as such, the way the alphabet was explained by the Etruscans would have involved providing the same pronunciation for both letters. And, as a result, all 3 letters were used in Old Latin for both g and g. And once again, from our modern perspective, it's easy for us to look back at this and say, oh, those pre-literate Italic peoples messed up. They should have noticed the pattern and realized that kappa and gamma were another voiceless pair, and that kappa was the voiceless one and gamma was the voiced one. But there's a few things worth keeping in mind. First, the Etruscans would not have organized these letters according to their pronunciations. Phonetics as a field of study almost certainly did not exist yet. The earliest known examples of people analyzing the sounds of speech happened in India about 100 years after the creation of the Latin alphabet. Additionally, one of the most persistent features of the alphabet is its order. As much as the shapes and phonetic values of the letters changed, the alphabetical order was preserved at each step in the chain from Phoenician to Old Latin. So it's reasonable to guess that the alphabet was explained in this order, making redundancies much harder to notice. Regardless of how it happened or whose fault it was, the Old Italic alphabet ended up with 3 separate letters which were all used for the sounds k and g interchangeably, the letters that would go on to become C, K, and Q. Well, not quite interchangeably. As the Etruscans did before them, the Latins used the letter Q whenever either velar plosive occurred before a rounded vowel, and they also used K before A. This distribution of the letter K was also found to some extent in Etruscan, though it wasn't as present as the rule of using Q before rounded vowels, and this use of K in Latin didn't stick around for too long either. As time progressed, Latin writers began to prefer using C over K in all contexts, but the use of Q stuck around. This is because Latin had a pair of labialized velar stops, that is, consonants pronounced with rounded lips, gu and gu. Both of these consonants would be written with the digraph QU. With Q given a proper purpose and K nearly abandoned, the problem of redundancy was replaced with a new problem of ambiguity, one which would eventually be corrected. In the negative 3rd century, the letter Z was officially removed from the Latin alphabet throughout the Roman Republic. This is credited to Appius Claudius the Blind, a Roman censor who just really didn't like the letter Z. I don't know exactly why he didn't like the letter Z. At the time, Z was the 7th letter of the alphabet, like its ancestors were in the scripts the Latin alphabet was descended from. In Etruscan, this letter probably represented the affricate ts, a sound which did not exist in Old Latin, but did exist in other Italic languages spoken at the time, and those languages used the letter Z for that specific sound. Despite this, there are multiple sources I've found that claim that the sound Z represented in -3rd century Latin was the same as its modern value, Z. This sound too did not exist in Latin at the time, although it had in the past. In some contexts, the voiceless sibilant S would become voiced to Z, specifically when it occurred between vowels. This pronunciation was entirely predictable from context within a word, and wasn't considered to be a separate phoneme, that is, a meaningfully different sound. Later, this voiceless sibilant became a trill, R, a sound shift known as rhoticization. This change was reflected in the spelling of words. There are some words which were spelled with an S in Old Latin that in later texts are spelled with an R instead. And so, some claim that this event is why the letter Z was unnecessary for writing Latin by the time of the censorship of Appius the Blind. However, I'm not entirely convinced that this is true. I'm by no means a historian, and there is a good chance that someone with more expertise in the history of this specific time period would be able to correct me on this, but I haven't seen any evidence of there being a point where these words, the ones where Z became R, were at any point spelled with the letter Z in Latin. All I can find is texts where they are spelled with S, and later texts where they are spelled with R, with no medial stage where they are spelled with Z. Given the pronunciation of Z as Z in other Italic languages of the time, I find it more likely that is the pronunciation that Appius associated with the letter, and the fact that it did not occur in Latin words would have been the reason he considered it unnecessary. Regardless of what reasons he may have had, Appius's distaste for the letter Z is today credited as the reason why it was removed from the Latin alphabet. Appius was, after all, very influential. An influencer, if you will, and his belief that the letter ought to be removed resulted in it being dropped from the alphabet. However, without Z, the alphabet suddenly had an opening for a new 7th letter. And this is where the true hero of our story comes in, the elementary school teacher, Spurius Carvilius Ruga. Yes, apparently, there were elementary school teachers in the Roman Republic. Wikipedia confidently claims with no inline citation that Ruga was the first person in recorded history to open a private elementary school. This put him in a uniquely powerful position. Ruga was one of the first people to ever be responsible for teaching the Latin alphabet to a group of children. In the process of teaching the alphabet, Ruga became extremely aware of a flaw with the design of the alphabet itself, that the letter C was used for 2 separate sounds, K and G, with no way of knowing which one it represented in any given word. It certainly helped that his name was Ruga, and that from its spelling and the orthography of the time, R-U-C-A, it was impossible to tell if it was pronounced Ruga or Ruka. And as the story goes, Ruga solved this problem by inventing a new letter, one which would fill the hole left behind by the removal of Z, which was still pretty recent at that point. By simply adding an extra line to the letter C, you could now specify unambiguously when a word contains the voiced G, as opposed to the voiceless G. However, Ruga wasn't the first person to ever use this letter. He didn't actually invent it himself, but because of his uniquely powerful position as one of the very first elementary school teachers in the Roman Republic, the exact way Ruga used G, as a new 7th letter of the alphabet to replace Z, became the new standard. There was, of course, another perhaps simpler way it could have happened. If only Ruga had known, we might say, that this distinction between K and G had already been solved. The fully redundant letter K, which nobody really still used, could have been brought back to now exclusively represent K, and then C could have been used for the missing voiced G. However, this was not to be, and using the letter K wasn't even considered as a possibility. In fact, it's easy to imagine a version of history where Appius the Blind suggested reforms to the alphabet also removed the letter K from the alphabet, as it too was unnecessary to write Latin words. In the centuries to come, the Roman Republic transformed into the Roman Empire, and, with the conquest of Greece, the relationship between the Greek and Latin alphabets changed. A pair of letters were added to the end of the alphabet, to be used exclusively for writing Greek words in the Latin script. And with that, after having been absent from the alphabet for a couple hundred years, the letter Z returned. Or should I say Z? At some point in the cultural exchange process between the Cumaean alphabet and the Old Latin alphabet, the notion that every letter has its own unique name was lost, and letters were instead given simple names according to the sounds they represented. most of which naturally evolved into the current English names of the letters. But the pair of Greek letters added to the end of the alphabet represented sounds that were not present in Latin to begin with, so rather than names based on their pronunciations, they were given names reflecting their Greek origins. For the reintroduced Z, its name was zeta, loaned from its name in ancient Greek. But that said, with the introduction of G, the letter C finally no longer represented two separate sounds. However, this wouldn't last. As the Roman Empire fell, the Latin, once spoken all throughout Europe, branched off into the Romance languages. One major difference in pronunciation between the Romance languages and Latin is a dramatic sound shift known as palatalization. In the development of the Romance languages, palatalization was a sound shift that caused some consonants to be pronounced differently when they occurred before front vowels, E and A. This appears in every modern Romance language to some extent, and in almost all of them, it resulted in multiple pronunciations of the letters C and G, depending on what vowel comes after them. And to be clear, English is not one of these languages. English is not descended from Latin. While English is distantly related to the Romance languages, English is not itself a Romance language. In summary, K and G before front vowels became the affricates Ts and J and the medieval common ancestor of Western Romance languages. This is what created soft C and soft G. This use of C and G, with two separate pronunciations each, was copied directly into Middle English. Middle English spelling was based directly on Old French, and modern English spelling is inherited directly from Middle English. Of course, since which pronunciation either letter had in Old French, as well as other Romance languages, could usually be reliably predicted from context, this was fine and didn't really cause problems. Not yet, anyway. However, grafting this orthography onto a non-Romance language, like Middle English, would and in fact did cause problems, and directly created some of the most debated ambiguous spellings in modern English to this day. Without having the same phonological history, it was completely normal for English words to have velar stops before front vowels, and spelling these according to Old French rules required a workaround. In some languages that started using the Latin alphabet at around the same time, spelling words in a way that made sense to speakers of Romance languages wasn't a priority, and so they avoided this problem by simply not worrying about it. This approach can be seen in some Celtic languages, which, for example, use the letter C for K regardless of context. For Middle English, spelling words in a way that would be intuitive to speakers of Old French was considered very important, and so, using C for K before front vowels was heavily avoided, as this would have been misinterpreted as meaning Ts, or once the pronunciations of the soft consonants shifted, as S. To solve this, the letter K, which was used rarely, if ever, in Old French, was dusted off and repurposed as a less ambiguous alternative to be used for these words. This solution of using K as a less ambiguous option for writing K is found in many languages, and indeed it's commonplace to avoid using C for K altogether. However, as you've surely noticed, soft C is one of a pair of soft consonants built into the Latin alphabet. The other is soft G. And unlike C, there isn't an extra unused letter that can take its place. While this isn't an unsolvable problem, no solution at all was used for Middle English, and directly because of this careless oversight, one of the most infamously ambiguous aspects of English spelling was created, which, in recent decades, has been the subject of one of the least productive debates in online discourse. And it's a little bit strange, I think, that despite both C and G having multiple pronunciations in English for the exact same reason, and despite the fact that between the two, C is clearly the less ambiguous one, C is the letter that gets all of the unwarranted hate. Sure, maybe having both C and K might seem a little redundant, but I'd take redundancy over ambiguity any day. And, in fact, the commonly suggested quote-unquote solution of replacing C with either K or S depending on the word would cause English spelling to become far more ambiguous. Even ignoring the countless words where C is pronounced as something that isn't K or S, soft C is uniformly pronounced more consistently than S in the same contexts. S is often voiced, Z, while soft C is pretty much always voiceless, S. When S occurs between vowels, it's actually very hard to predict if it's pronounced as S or Z, to the point where there's some words where the pronunciation of S is dependent entirely on the way the word is being used, and not reflected by spelling whatsoever. Compare the noun house to the verb house. By replacing soft C with S, it would be introducing even more of this ambiguity to English spelling, despite being a change proposed as a way to make spelling more consistent. Removing the letter C would require changing everything else around it, and it's not even really necessary. There are a lot of things that are strange and irregular about English spelling, but the two separate pronunciations of C are far from the worst case of this, or even really an example of something irregular in English spelling in the first place. There is one more use of the letter C in English that is very important, and one that even those who claim C is redundant concede as a core part of its role in our orthography, and that is the digraph CH. In English, ch is generally used in two separate, mostly unrelated ways. The first, much older use, is for transcribing Greek words. In Latin, the aspirated stop consonants in ancient Greek were transcribed according to what they sounded like. They were pronounced as voiceless consonants but breathier, so they are spelled as voiceless consonants followed by h. This is where the digraphs ph, th, and ch all come from. In ancient Greek words that made their way into modern English, ch is pronounced like k, similar to its pronunciation in ancient Greek. However, ph and th are pronounced as fricatives, f and th, with th in particular being used all the time in native English words that contain dental fricatives. This use is derived from the pronunciations of these consonants in modern Greek, where ancient p, t, k naturally evolved into the fricatives f, th, ch. In some languages, such as German, the digraph ch is used for the velar fricative ch for this same reason. The other way ch is used in English is, like many other aspects of English spelling, borrowed from Old French. While almost all Romance languages went through palatalization of k before the vowels e and e, French specifically went even further, with k becoming ch before the open vowel a. Importantly, this was pronounced differently from both hard C and soft C, and since this context wasn't a normal position for palatalization to occur in other Romance languages, it was considered necessary to respell this new ch whenever it occurred, and the solution used was the digraph ch. In French itself, this would eventually change to be pronounced as sh instead, but the use of ch for ch in Old French was copied directly into Middle English, inherited into Modern English, and from its use in Modern English copied into many other languages. There is something that I find fascinating about this, however. As you may recall, all the way back in Old Latin, k was the letter used whenever k or g appeared before a, and that's the exact same context where k palatalized to ch in Old French. If the use of the letter k before a had never fallen out of fashion in the Roman Republic, speakers of Old French wouldn't have needed to come up with a new way to represent the sound ch, because it would have already been written with its own separate letter before the sound shift even happened. If this had been the case, we'd almost certainly use k for the sound ch in English, and use c just as ambiguously as g. Throughout the whole history of the alphabet, there are so many minor things like that would have resulted in massively different modern spellings if they had been even slightly different. In the present day, c is used in a wide variety of ways. Some languages imitate the hard C, soft C paradigm found in Romance languages the same way English does, as seen in languages from Vietnamese to classical Nahuatl. Others take the redundancy of C, K, and Q and repurpose the extra letters for sounds that would otherwise be hard to represent, taking advantage of the multitude of ways that C has been used. In languages like Polish, C is used for ts, like the soft C of early Western Romance languages. A similar use of C is found in Pinyin, the standard way of transcribing Mandarin Chinese into the Latin alphabet. Pinyin also makes the very bold aesthetic choice to use Q for kya, a sound which formed from Mandarin's own palatalization sound shift that affected k when it appeared before e. Many dislike this use of Q in Pinyin, but they're all wrong. It makes perfect sense given the phonological history of the language, and it looks rad as heck. There is no limit to how deeply you could explore this. The history of writing is as old as history itself. The little idiosyncrasies found in the Latin alphabet are, in many ways, what give it its own charm. And this isn't unique to this one alphabet. Every writing system has its own quirks, and especially writing systems that are thousands of years old. The Latin alphabet probably isn't suited for its role as the dominant writing system used worldwide. While it fits the Romance languages that naturally descend from the language it was initially designed for just fine, there are compromises involved in getting it to work for literally anything else. When a language like English embraces this historical baggage, it might be frustrating to those attempting to learn the language, but I think it makes things a lot more fun. You might not agree with me on that, and that's fine. But maybe one day, you'll see. I've been Jan Misali, and
letter C has folks saying it should be removed, that without it the alphabet would be improved. It's a common complaint that's misguided at best. No, you can't just replace C with K and with S. No, you can't just replace C with K and with S. You know, S becomes voiced in her vocalic, and suffixes preserved.